Hi, I'm Holly and I'm from New Zealand. Now, having seen all of the responses thus far for the Reading Diversity tag, I couldn't help but notice that there haven't been many recommendations or books that people have on their TBR which are from New Zealand. And that's not overly surprising to me because we're a pretty small country and, you know, a lot of people haven't even heard of us. The reason that I called our continent Oceania and not Australasia in that video was because when you say Australasia, people automatically think Australia. And actually, Australasia does also mean New Zealand and the Pacific. Anyway, in light of all of that, I thought I would take this opportunity to share some of my recommendations for New Zealand literature because I think that we do punch above our weight for the size of our country with our literature. This is by no means an exclusive list, it's just some books that I've read from my own country and would like to share. So for starters we have Katherine Mansfield. I've got the complete stories here. She was a modernist writer about the same time as Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence, and she was within that group of people as well. And she wrote exclusively short stories. She grew up in Wellington, which is the capital of New Zealand, and she went over to London to study. Then she came back briefly and then left again for the UK and never came back. But we still claim her as basically our equivalent of a bard. I would argue that she's the first major writer of the New Zealand canon and I love her. Her short stories are wonderful. You can pick up collections of her stories such as The Garden Party. This is a bind up of all of the collections. Also particularly interesting are her journals and her letters to characters such as D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. I just find them absolutely fascinating and it really sheds light on her stories as well. Next on my list is Janet Frame, and I've only read one of her books, which was Owls Do Cry, and that's owls like Hedwig, twit-twoo, in case you can't understand my accent. This is a story of a family in New Zealand and how these children are growing up in poverty. I think it's a really interesting examination of what it means to be poor, and it's also really interesting in terms of mental illness because several of these characters do have some sort of mental illness, and it's about stigma that surrounds that, and you get these parts which are inside their minds as well, and you get this kind of stream of consciousness. Owls Do Cry came out in the 1950s and I think it was pretty progressive for its time. This is one book of hers that I haven't yet read, but it's on my to be read soon. This is the Carpathians. A lot of her books come in these really lovely editions that are sort of somewhere between hardback and paperback. I'm looking forward to getting to that one. Next up we have a book that I've read very recently. This is The Bone People, that was written in the 1980s and was the winner of the 1985 Booker Prize. Keri Hulme is a Māori author and I was really interested in reading more authors of Māori descent because most of the New Zealand literature that I had read was from the white Pākehā perspective. This is a pretty harrowing novel. It takes place on the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand, which is known for its rough weather and tumultuous seas. It's based around three characters. There's a man and his adopted son, and then there's this woman who is the protagonist and is quite clearly based on Hulme herself. In particular, it's an examination of domestic violence and looks at it from a number of different angles, which is really, really fascinating, although quite difficult to read at times. It also explores the idea of asexuality because the main female character identifies as asexual, so that's another really interesting aspect of this book. It took me a wee while to get into this because you've got this kind of stream of consciousness technique going on, and the prose is unusual. I've never read anything written quite in this way. I would recommend this, but also caution there because it's got some pretty harsh themes. Next up is another book associated with the Man Booker Prize. This book was shortlisted in 2007 and is Mr. Pip by Lloyd Jones. Now, I talked about this in my Reading Diversity tag, so I won't go into great detail. This one is set on the tropical island of Bougainville amidst their civil war, and it's about the only white man on the island, and he's a teacher and he's reading his students' Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This is a delightful and also very shocking novel. It sort of lures you into the sense that everything is fine and lovely and they're on this beautiful island and reading Dickens and isn't everything charming, and then there's this aspect of war, and it's a very hard-hitting little novel. I'd highly recommend that you go and pick this one up. Next up is another of my favourite New Zealand authors. This is Elizabeth Knox, and she wrote this book. This is The Vintner's Luck and was published in 1998. This is a kind of delightful story about an angel who falls from heaven and falls in love with a man who is a vintner. It's set in France in the early 1800s, and it's really about this relationship. The vintner has quite a hard time coming to terms with this. He is married, and this idea of a homosexual relationship with an angel is really explored in a very wonderful way. I would highly recommend this book. Another book written by Elizabeth Knox is Wake, and I've talked about this briefly in other videos. This is a horror novel, which is not something that I've ever read before, but after having seen Elizabeth Knox talk about it, I was really intrigued and wanted to read it. This is set in a small fictional town, which is very close to where I live. Basically, there's a whole bunch of people get trapped in this bubble, which is a sort of typical sci-fi trope, and they're locked in there with this invisible monster that starts messing with their heads. And it's quite the psychological thriller. Elizabeth Knox has also written a few young adult novels, such as this one here. This is Mortal Fire, and you can see that it won a New Zealand Book Award. I haven't read any of her young adult fiction, but I figure if her adult fiction is anything to go by, she can probably pull off doing young adult. Also, this has got a really, really neat cover. Stickers aside, it's got these bees that look kind of like killer bees or something on there. Another book with a really beautiful cover is Wulf by Hamish Clayton. This book was released a couple of years ago and is a debut novel. It's published by Penguin. I actually studied this novel in one of my courses, and it was particularly to look at postmodernism in fiction. And what makes this postmodernism is that it's historical fiction, but it's also sort of tied up with the myth of Beowulf. And then you've got this legend of Te Raupraha, who was an actual historical figure, but sort of becomes something of legend in this book. He was a very famous Māori chief, and he was also the one who wrote the words for what is now used as the traditional New Zealand haka. So this really explores the clash of European and Māori, and that's also kind of symbolised in the way that the myth of Beowulf comes together with this legend of Te Raupraha. So that's another one that I would really recommend. And it wouldn't be a video on New Zealand literature, or even a video on my channel, without mentioning Eleanor Catton. This is her first book. It's called The Rehearsal, and this is set in a girls' boarding school, and it's about a scandal that takes place there. I remember reading this a few years ago and being absolutely struck by her prose, and I really want to reread this for that reason. The Luminaries takes that to the next level, and it's not only beautifully, beautifully written, but it is the most complex and incredible storyline. Please, please don't be scared of the size of this book, because it does need to be as long as it is for everything to tie up in the end, and it is just expertly executed and well deserving of the Man Booker Prize last year. I am ever so slightly obsessed with Eleanor Catton and do actually own 3 copies of the Luminaries. If you are interested in New Zealand history at all, or want to find out more, a great book that I can recommend is Michael King's Penguin History of New Zealand. This is a very readable history book and covers so much. It starts with the first Māori settlers and goes up until more or less the end of the 20th century. So there's my recommendations for New Zealand literature. Please do let me know if you found this helpful or interesting, and let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you now want to read any of these books. I am quite keen to do a full series on New Zealand literature. I certainly want to do a whole video on Katherine Mansfield, because I think that her life and her writings are so interesting and so overlooked. So please let me know your thoughts. If hashtag NZLit became a thing, it would make me so happy. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I will hopefully see you next time. Bye!